It will be recorded, and that way everybody can just hear us as best as possible. You're welcome to turn your camera on if you like to be part of a not physical, but more physical presence, but you are not required to at all. But I am Danielle Wetmore. I am the Director of Education for the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation and have so enjoyed hosting these gateways and dialogue to delve into different aspects about the relationship and compare and contrast these two immigration stations. And I'm honored to be here with my colleague, Stephen.
Hey everybody, my name is Stephen. I am the director of the American Family Immigration History Center, which is an on-site and online research facility hosted by the Statue of Liberty-Ellis Island Foundation. And I'm really excited to be here. I am gonna take a minute to just start sharing my screen and get the send a request, and we will get the presentations rolling. I've subtitled my presentation Working in the In-Between, and select this, get us in presentation mode so you don't have to see anything but the template. So working in between. Ellis Island is physically in between the Statue of Liberty and the island of Manhattan. And it's sort of a place where folks on an immigrant journey were in between too. So your status in your old life versus the status in the new life that you were hoping awaited you, these were things that put people in a kind of limbo. And the folks that worked on Ellis Island, they inhabited this sort of in-between space. And in a lot of ways, they were in between too. They had competing loyalties. So what does it take to run an island like Ellis Island? Well, generally speaking, you have between 400 and 700 employees at any given time. This could change depending on how busy the era of Ellis Island was, how busy the time of year was. In 1913, there are 525 persons employed on the island, not counting all the medical officers and medical attendants, according to Popular Science Monthly. And that highlights a really good point. Ellis Island itself is divided between these two government agencies. You have immigration services on the one hand and the public health service on the other. These two organizations were supposed to work in tandem, but sometimes they would have differing goals and differing methods. And each of these agencies had different divisions. When we look at the pictures of Ellis Island, like the one on the right, most of our focus is towards the immigrants, and that's totally understandable. We've got 12 million people being processed here. We've got, between 30 and 40% of the American population being able to trace their roots to one of these folks that were coming through Ellis Island. But you look at the pictures a little bit more closely, and you're gonna see lots and lots of people working here too, keeping the buildings running, keeping those people moving through. Even on these really dramatic photos of the registry room, if you kind of look around the edges of the crowd, you're gonna see people at work. Inspectors, clerks, matrons, guardsmen and watchmen, people who are working in the telegraph office. Basically anything that you could need to be done on Ellis Island, it was performed by a public servant or maybe like a vendor or a contractor. And with so many different jobs to do, with so many different people working here, those hundreds of employees, you had to split up this labor somehow. We know a lot about the divisions of labor during peak Ellis Island years from this cheery looking fellow on the left. His name is William Williams. He was a commissioner of Ellis Island during a lot of those boom years, those peak immigration years on Ellis. And he worked for the Immigration Service. He was part of the Department of Treasury at one point. The Immigration Service later moved to Department of Commerce and Labor. And at Ellis Island, all of these different divisions that you see on the right-hand side of the screen existed, and they all worked together to make the island function. Don't worry about keeping them all straight, because even William Williams said he was here over 5 months before he understood the intricacies of how these different divisions work together. And he thought if he was having a hard time figuring it out, he could only wonder how the inspectors and other folks who worked for him could. even the executive division that he was directly in charge of, you can see on the left, it has sort of a hodgepodge of different duties. External affairs with the offices in DC, appeals, executing warrants for immigrants that were being brought back to Ellis Island, carrying government property, and supervising all the other divisions. While you were at Ellis Island, you would run into these other divisions pretty much from the time you entered the harbor. We have on the left-hand side here something that I think is kind of neat. It's the oath of office that a woman named Maud Mosher had to take. Maud was not very high up on the corporate ladder. She was a matron, which is basically a non-medical attendant for female identified immigrants at Ellis Island. We can see from her immigration service oath that she's earning the princely sum of $720 a year in 1903. And when you were at Ellis, you first encountered the boarding division. You'd encounter them because they would come to the ship and actually board it to get those documents, the manifest records. When you were in the registry room, you would be inspected by the registry division. If you needed to receive information from folks who were already over in the US or beyond, if you needed to send or receive any kind of telegraph, you would be dealing with the information division. And the Special Inquiry Division, they were the ones running the boards of special inquiry in case you got pulled aside and inspected and needed to state your case why you should stay. The Deporting Division are for those unlucky 2% who were sent back. The Statistical Division was kind of behind the scenes, sending all of this data down to DC. And the Structural and Labor Divisions, they were the ones keeping all the buildings running, functioning inside and outside. And finally, we have the Night Division. There were only about 30 folks that worked on the Night Division, but at any given time in Ellis Island's history, you could have as many as 2,000 people overnighting here. So anytime you see somebody doing something that isn't strictly medical, like in all of these photos, you're pretty much looking at an immigrant service employee. We can see how many employees were working at Ellis Island during some of these peak years based on the U.S. Register of Civil and Military and Naval Service. These are extremely handy for us because not only do they tell us how many employees were working at any given time, you can see the employee workforce is growing even in just the 2 years that I've shown here. We can also see where these folks were born. So Ellis Island was not just a place that immigrants were inspected, but between 3 and 4 out of every 10 employees on Ellis Island during these peak years were themselves immigrants. And these are all of the different kinds of jobs that are listed in the civil registry for people who worked at Ellis Island. All different kinds of clerks, bookkeepers, people who ran the laundry, elevator conductors, dynamo tenders who helped run the electric generators. And we see Maud Mosher over there. The other side of the coin is the Public Health Service. So the Public Health Service actually stayed under the auspices of Department of Treasury during Ellis Island's time. And there are 3 divisions. They have a boarding division of their own because they're going on board the ship to inspect cabin class passengers. They're going on board the ship to make sure pandemics hadn't broken out. Then you have the line division. Those are the guys that you see conducting the line inspection at Ellis Island, where they're looking under people's eyelids and checking their scalp and stuff like that. And finally, you have the hospital division, where all the nurses and surgeons and the attendants and the orderlies were working in either the general hospital that we see on this slide or in the contagious disease ward. So these are some photographs of people who were working at Ellis as public health service employees. And the Public Health Service grew and contracted with Ellis Island's role. Lots of folks who worked for Public Health Service, they lived on the island. Nurses were required to live on the island in most cases. So when you talk about taking a job on Ellis Island, you're really talking about eating and working and sleeping and living there all the time. USPS PHS presence started in 1892 when first Ellis Island opened. They only had 1 doctor and 3 nurses. But as time went on, that's going to grow. And as the function of Ellis Island changed from one of inspection to one of detention, the kinds of diseases and the kinds of maladies they were helping fix in people changed from something that was acute and contagious, like a fever or an influenza, to more along the lines of a chronic disease like tuberculosis or even psychiatric care. Because they lived on the island, we do catch USPHS employees on the federal census every 10 years. And when you go through the census records, not only do you notice how many immigrants are working on Ellis Island, but if you look at where their parents are from, over two-thirds of people working on Ellis Island during peak years had at least one really strong immigrant connection. At least one parent was an immigrant. And that's something that's really fascinating to me because not only are these folks living beside the people that they are caring for, they have the same experience, if not in their own life, at least something in a very close relative's life too. And public health was seen basically as covering three different layers or three different aspects. There's the physical aspect, the moral or mental aspect, and the social aspect too. So by the time 1924 is here, before quotas start, you had all these different kinds of jobs taking care of these three different aspects of public health. Everything from surgeons to cooks, all those buildings over on the south side of Ellis Island, there's like 22 hospital buildings. You needed construction employees too. Everything under the sun was happening at the hospital at Ellis Island, from births to people dying. So I'd like to focus on three different folks who worked on Ellis. These are some folks that are not that well known, but maybe they should be. I'm going to start in chronological order with a gentleman named Nahib Arbili. Nahib was an immigrant from Damascus. His family's credited as the first Syrian family to immigrate to the United States in 1878, and they were celebrated in the press at the time of their arrival. The name on the manifest you see on this slide, Damaskina, it's a demonym for people from Damascus. So the Arbili's quote unquote family name is nowhere to be found, and it reflects different cultures and different naming customs that can sometimes make arrival records kind of hard to find. The narrative of their family story, the reason why it was so celebrated, leaned heavily on the trope of Christians escaping oppression in the Ottoman Empire. Most Syrian immigrants who began arriving in large numbers a little bit later in the 1880s were Christians. Nahib's family originally went to Maryville, Tennessee, of all places. His father got a job as a professor at a Bible college. His knowledge of languages like Arabic and Hebrew and English certainly helped him. Nahib himself acquired a college education and became a professor. And he was appointed the consul in Jerusalem, but the Ottoman officials objected to his appointment, probably because he's one of those folks who left the Ottoman Empire voluntarily, and he returned to the US, where he became an attorney. He was a notary public, and he also published the first Arabic language newspaper in North America. You can see it on the right-hand side of this slide. Um, Also, and crucially for this presentation, Nahib, who you can see in the middle of this slide, was an interpreter at Castle Garden, the first immigration station in New York City, and on Ellis Island. So I see him listed as an immigration inspector on the 1900 census, but I can't confirm he was in the new Ellis Island building, which was opened in December of 1900, but he was definitely an interpreter at the original Ellis Island. His legal skills and his translation services in, quote, French, German, Italian, Syrian, and other language were advertised in local papers. And he also used his newspaper, the Kaukab America, it means Star of America, that was used to publish useful information for the Syrian diaspora. There's a really good quote on this slide from a book about Syrian immigration called Strangers in the West. It says, the Arbeelys felt an obligation to their fellow countrymen to let them know what America was like and to encourage them to come. So as an immigrant and as somebody who spoke Arabic fluently, Nahib was in a really unique position at Castle Garden and at Angel Island. He would use his linguistic skills to point fellow Arabic speakers to the neighborhood I have circled on this map, Little Syria, which was just across the street from Battery Park, where Castle Garden was. However, he also used his linguistic skills and his past relationship with the Ottoman Empire and perhaps the Muslim community that lived in the Ottoman Empire to become more of an interrogator and to help deny entrance to those whose religious beliefs might condone polygamy. There's a newspaper article on the right-hand side of this that talks about a case that he was the interpreter for, where 6 polygamists who were Arab Muslims are turned away because the questioners were able to ask them, do you believe in the Quran? Well, the Quran preaches polygamy, right? And sort of entrap these guys into saying something that maybe they didn't quite understand. And the next person I'm going to talk about is one of my favorites. Her name is Margaret V. Daly. And Margaret was not an immigrant. She was actually born in New York, but her career as a public health service nurse is intertwined with the first 3 decades of the new Ellis Island Hospital. When Margaret started working, it was actually the first day that the new Ellis Island Hospital opened in 1902. So this is what Ellis Island looked like when Margaret showed up for her first day of work. And her role as a nurse was dependent on her meeting the requirements at the time. Nurses were required to be, and I'm quoting here, between the ages of 26 and 38 years, single and graduates of a reputable training school for nurses. So Margaret had experience in obstetric care. She was one of the 8 nurses to report to Ellis Island. And that was in 1902, 8 nurses, 1902. She found a place professionally, like most of these professional women, within this rigid military-like hierarchy of the public health service, even if her place wasn't at the top of it. She did get promoted to chief nurse, but that still put her well below the health service physicians, which until 1914 were all male on Ellis Island. So she witnessed the evolution of hospital facilities and the duties required of nurses in the public health service. Staffing levels changed over time, and excuse me, and she saw that technology was advancing too. During World War I, in 1918, she and the other public health service professionals were actually removed from the island because the Army and Navy took over the facilities. She took responsibility for refurbishing the facilities at Stapleton Hospital over in Staten Island, everything from painting the wards and painting the hospital beds to cooking and cleaning. She did all of that just to keep the place running and to get the place in a state that it could take care of patients. Um, she also refurbished Ellis Island after the Army left it when World War I was over, and the Public Health Service said, we're going to take responsibility for taking care of military personnel too. She had to balance the duties of caring for enemy aliens detained on Ellis Island while also serving the needs of convalescing servicemen. And that's something that she mentions in her memoir that is freely available online. She says, we had to be continuously alert and guard our speech, as there might be spies amongst us. And after the war, when all of those military personnel were being taken care of, Margaret saw the physical and emotional damage of war, and her duties grew. Advances in technology moved nurses into the operating room. It also meant that nurses were providing psychiatric care under the instruction of physicians. And after quotas were put in place, Margaret and her staff's duties became less focused on caring for those acute diseases like cholera, scarlet fever, and trachoma. Margaret understood the need for taking care of psychiatric patients, which became more and more of her duties because she was once attacked by a psychiatric patient who was in the general hospital ward at Ellis Island. Um, she's gonna tell lots of stories in her memoir about the tragedy of watching families being split apart, being deported, suffering losses. She mentions pregnant women giving birth while in line. telling no one of their condition since babies who were born on Ellis Island were not guaranteed citizenship. So they're going to hide the fact that they're in labor, hoping they can make it to New York or New Jersey, this American soil. She mentions repeatedly that she was there to care for positions, but she couldn't change the law. She definitely couldn't determine whether someone was deported or not. She says that it was especially hard to witness the separation of families when perhaps the hopes of a lifetime were shattered. And her duties may have become less hectic, but they were no less taxing as Ellis Island transitioned into a place of detention. In addition to the psychiatric patients, taking care of servicemen and immigrant alike with chronic conditions exposed Margaret and her staff to diseases like tuberculosis. It was tuberculosis that actually ended Margaret's life. She succumbed to tuberculosis in 1936. Her symptoms caused her to be, quote, retired to Stapleton Hospital over in Staten Island in May of 1936, and by November, she had passed away. She's one of those folks that started at Ellis Island and basically dedicated the rest of her life to it, in this case, about 34 years. And last but certainly not least, we have Edward Corsi. Edward Corsi was the commissioner of immigration at Ellis Island. He was in charge of the whole thing. And he was not the only immigrant to hold this position, but he is the only immigrant who came through Ellis Island that became commissioner. And you can see the manifest here when he arrived in 1906 with his mother, his stepfather, and siblings. He's using the name Norino Corsi. His biological father had passed away in Italy, and his mother had remarried a man who resigned from the army and wanted to start life over. Corsi says to start life over at any work beneath his caste would have been embarrassing in Italy, but America was different. There, my stepfather could take any sort of employment at first, and nobody would think any worse of him. So he recounts his arrival vividly. Something that's really funny about his arrival is he thought that the skyscrapers of the Manhattan skyline were mountains, and he asked his brother why there was no snow on them. He saw people of other cultures and other ethnicities. He saw new technology like elevated trains for the first time. But afterward, his family would basically disintegrate because of the trauma of the immigrants' journey and what awaited them in New York. His mother became a ritornata, somebody who went back to Italy after living in the US, and she died in Italy of illnesses that she picked up in the crowded tenement living conditions in New York City. His first job was actually as a street lamp lighter, but he would later join a settlement house known as Harlem House, which awakened a kind of civic duty in him. After earning a law degree at Fordham, he would go back to work at Harlem House. So he became kind of a community organizer. And he was also somebody that was appointed in charge of the 1930 census in Manhattan in 1930. So because of his reputation, his connections to the community, President Hoover appointed him as commissioner. Ellis Island looked like this and its surroundings when he took over in 1931. So he only worked as an immigrant commissioner from 31 to 34, but he did write a memoir, and I'm sort of sprinkling quotes from that memoir in these slides as we go along. Even though he was only commissioner for maybe 3 years or so during off-peak years after Ellis Island was not really a place of inspection, he left us a lot of stories of Ellis Island. His memoir is not just about himself, it's also about the history of the island. Even though he was more likely, and he admitted, I'm more likely to have to deport somebody than to have to inspect them and welcome them. He gifted us with this wonderful, sometimes apocryphal, sometimes a self-aggrandizing memoir, collecting all these stories of people that were coming through. And he often spoke of humanizing the system. And one way that he tried to do this was by telling the very human stories connected with Ellis Island. We know a lot of the stories and lore of Ellis Island because of Edward Corsi. He tells a story about hosting a Christmas concert that was broadcast over the radio. And then when he realized that over 200 people in the audience were actually at Ellis Island waiting to be deported, the sense of shame that overcame him. Um, we know the story of a young man named Alejandro Velez. Alejandro, in Corsi's words, was a woman in man's clothes. And Corsi says, and he's misgendering Alejandro here, so we're going to not let him off the hook, but just understand that. Corsi says that she answered that she would rather kill herself than wear women's clothes. Perhaps some psychoanalyst can explain it, but she said she had always wanted to be a man, and it was no fault of hers that she had not been born one. This is the time around 1897. So it's quite remarkable that he's even taking that much of an understanding attitude and mentioning psychotherapy and psychoanalysts when talking about Alejandro. He takes also a surprisingly sympathetic view towards the quote, radicals who were deported during the Red Scare, which happened a little bit before his time. He refers to Emma Goldman as the most interesting radical, an extraordinary woman, so honest in all that she said and did, with a pure and vibrant style. He tells really funny stories like the saxophone player. There's a saxophone player who's detained at Ellis Island that plays Ah, Sweet Mystery of Life for the other detainees at night. And Corsi says, it seems that the crime for which this saxophone player was deported, other than the saxophone playing, was that of bigamy. So I'm guessing Edward Corsi was not a jazz fan. But he also tells really sad stories. Stories about stowaways like Nicholas Pratza. Nicholas Pratza was a Croatian immigrant who, with two others, tried to stow away thanks to very well-paid traffickers, and they were hidden inside the steam stacks of a steamship just above the boilers. Of course, he dies of heat and exhaustion long before he can arrive in New York City. And Edward Corsi takes a really sympathetic view about the humanity that's robbed of people that are caught up in this trafficking practice. But if you're reading Edward Corsi's book, also note he's using really embarrassing, strange language in some cases, especially when he's talking about Chinese immigrants. Corsi was first and foremost a political figure. He ran for Senate in New York in 1938. He ran for the mayor of New York in 1950. So, like all political memoirs, we have to take this one with a little bit of salt. But he is very open about the struggle that he felt between carrying out the law and the empathy he felt for his fellow man who just happened to be on Ellis Island. And I like to end it with a quote from Popular Science. Yet in all the rushing hurry and the seeming confusion of a full day, all the babble of language, the excitement and fright and wonder of thousands of newly landed, and in all the manifold and endless details that make up the immigration plant, there is a system, silent, watchful, swift, efficient. So behind all of these stories and the crush of immigrants and the evolution of immigration legislation and the immigrant waves that came through, there are folks like Nahib, like Margaret, like Edward, who were kind of in the background making it all work. And I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to hand it over to Danielle so we can hear about Angel Island.
Thank you. And of course, those systems exist only because people run them, right? These aren't systems that are just a conveyor belt that you press go on and then it just happens, that there just is an immigration process. That at both of our sites, it requires a ton of work and a ton of people, both on site and elsewhere, and big government systems. The growth of bureaucracy in the period of our islands and immigration stations is huge. The amount of paperwork that starts to be generated, the amount of just work that is being done. And so I'm starting my portion of the talk with this slightly obscure, slightly off-centered image, I guess, of Angel Island Immigration Station. Generally, when we look at pictures, we look at it sort of head on with the front of the administration building, but this is actually the top of the administration building. And the reason I chose this image to begin with is because in this outlook, you can start to see more of the structures that exist to run the site than really centering simply the site itself, right? The administration building is a place where immigrants spend a ton of time. But we can see how deep it is here. This building houses lots of different offices. It houses the kitchen, it houses the dining rooms, it houses the women's dormitories, it houses where the boards of special inquiry were being taken, right? So tons of people are going here to go to work. This back building here is the hospital. Again, people going there to work. These front buildings and these back buildings over here, these are employee cottages. So places that folks who are detained here are not spending time, but it requires people to live here to run these spaces. This is the men's detention center. And these are water towers. Angel Island didn't have enough fresh water on island to maintain fresh water for the whole population, because of course it wasn't only the immigration center that was on Angel Island, but the army was also present as well. So I read something today saying that there were 2 boats going back and forth every day, refilling these with water. So these didn't last even a whole day. And so the types of jobs, I wanted to put together a list because there are jobs that seem obvious when we think about immigration stations. And then there are jobs that you really have to start to think about being like, oh, that makes sense that they have one, but what does it like? Let's get there. So cooks, doctors, nurses, interpreters, immigration inspectors. Immigration inspector is a really broad term. Something I read said that there were 6 different divisions of immigration inspectors, but I wasn't able to find what those 6 different things were. And of course, throughout this time period, things are changing pretty rapidly too. It's something Stephen and I were talking about just before we officially started this call. There's a gardener on staff because the landscape is landscaped. There are stenographers. I read something that said that the amount of paperwork that each one immigration case, especially Chinese immigration cases, came up with, kept stenographers employed for many, many days. That the amount of paperwork that's being created here is huge. Guards, clerks, deckhands, right? Because it's an island, you need boat to get back and forth. You need people to deckhand those boats. Transportation employees, again, that's going to be mostly boat related, but not exclusively. Engineers, this means people who are taking care of the infrastructure of the site. Telephone operators, plumbers, carpenters, laundrymen, matrons, right? So you need a lot of people to be able to run this site, to be able to have a place where you're detaining people. And all of these people come from many different identities. If you see a star next to the type of work, that means that that's a job that also had female employees. In some cases, it was exclusively female employees like matrons, but interpreters, there were male and female interpreters. At the time that the Chinese Exclusion Act passed, it said there were regulations that said nobody who worked for immigration services could be Chinese. Pretty quickly, they figured out that they couldn't enforce the Chinese Exclusion Act if they didn't have anybody on staff who spoke Chinese. And most of the people who spoke Chinese were of Chinese heritage. There's some interesting stories that exist about different individuals and their identities and how that's being worked out under this. But interpreters is one of the main categories that really pushed for that change. So by the time Angel Island opens as an immigration station in 1910, a lot of that had been worked out already. Most of the people who are doing some of these jobs are coming by boat. They're coming every day. They are commuting. They are taking a staff boat. I have a picture of a staff boat somewhere. Coming to the pier and getting off and leaving. And so they're working roughly 9 to 5 in their hours. But of course, the detainees themselves are staying here overnight, and there are certain jobs that also require you to stay overnight. And these are the engineers, gardener, electrician, Chinese cooks, hospital workers, and laundry. And so a lot of these are jobs that if something goes wrong overnight and you need it to be fixed, you need this person there, the engineers and the electrician. Hospital workers, sick people need care around the clock. Laundry, I just think is because the amount of laundry that was being created here. Please note here that Chinese cooks are living at the station, whereas non-Chinese cooks or white cooks, they're going back and forth. This was done because of a concern of the sharing of information between Chinatown and the immigration station. Any Chinese employees were not trusted. They faced incredible suspicion. And so there's a lot of things that are done to try to mitigate imagined ways that they are messing up the immigration process. But these numbers change over time, right? Before Angel Island opens as an immigration station and the immigration service is in San Francisco, the total number of employees was 30. By 1920, 10 years into the running of Angel Island as an immigration station, there are 137 employees. That seems to be about the peak, right around there. I don't want to guarantee exactly 137 being the peak, but it's in that time and in that range. And then by 1934, it falls to 104 employees and sort of stays there until the immigration station closes in 1940. A couple of the reasons for this fall is the Great Depression, is the amount of money that anybody has in order to run anything, but also the more laws are passed and fewer immigrants are coming. And so you don't need quite as many people to manage the immigration station because there's not as many people there. For those who were living at the station, they weren't just individuals living at the station. There were also families living at the station. So this image here is of employee cottages. Sort of random fact, these employee cottages were designed by Julia Morgan. We're hoping to be able to rebuild one of them. We have some money to do that right now. That money is contingent on us raising other money in order to do it and starting construction pretty soon. So if you have money you want to throw at this project, we are willing to take it. But there are 4 families sort of talked about in the research. Here, the Moonies, whose the father was an engineer, Hugh Mooney. The Perrys, also an engineer family for Alonzo Perry. The Thows, electrician Albert Thau, and the Garcias, laundryman Philip Garcia Sr. The Moonies live on island for quite some time. They have 7 children. And so there's a time where they're living it on the employee cottages. The employee cottages were not very big. And so they go back to living in San Francisco and they're like, rent is too high in San Francisco, still is. And then they come back to Angel Island and are dealing with cramped spacing. So really trying to find their balance and figuring out what to do there. We have oral history from Mrs. Mooney. But I'm sorry, my dog is barking. That I wanted to read a bit of, but she's asked, what did your husband do? He was in charge of the boat then, the maintenance. And so here in the bottom corner, you can sort of see that boat. This is the same boat. So if you worked on Angel Island, you use this boat. If you were coming to Angel Island because you were testifying on somebody's behalf, you use that boat. And so it's a shared experience on that boat. Anybody coming, if you're being let off Angel Island to go back to San Francisco because you're being landed, same boat. So that's all being mixed together there. How long was he there in that capacity? 20 years, from 1920 to 1940. And so he's there for the bulk of the time that it's open as an immigration station. You left after the fire. That is the fire that burned down the administration building in 1940. No, they moved to where Silver Avenue is, and he really didn't have much of a job there. The boat's not so much needed anymore. Then he enlisted in the Navy at 49 years old because he was a merchant marine engineer with an unlimited license, and the Navy wanted men to patrol the Pacific coast, older men to release younger men at sea duty, according to the Navy. My husband wound up in the South Pacific. Some young ones stayed on the Pacific coast. Were you living on the island until 1940? The house would get too small at times, and we moved to the city and have to pay rent. So then we moved back again, and we had 7 children. There were quarters on the island until the fire. Oh yes, right until the fire. None of the houses were burned in the fire. We have many of the pictures we have of the administration building on fire comes from the Mooney family. So I think that's why this oral history has so much of the fire as part of it. Those pictures, I think, were laid out in front of her as she was going through this oral history because she references them as you read through. And then we have, right, other people who also work on the island. Edouard Lee, he was an interpreter. He was born in Chinatown to Chinese parents. He was born in 1902, and he received a very good education. He has a BA from the College of the Pacific, a master's in political economics from UC Berkeley, and he was looking for work, and he was going and he was interviewing, and he was either not getting them at all, not being told why, or being told that the companies had policies against hiring, quote, Orientals. So he's really frustrated. And he was a member of a Methodist church. He meets somebody there who says, I'll introduce you to somebody on Angel Island. Perhaps you can get a job there. And so he gets a job on Angel Island, not because of his education, but because he grew up in Chinatown. And in growing up in Chinatown, he learned different dialects of Chinese in order to talk to different members of his community. And that was one of the main criteria to be hired. He says in his biography, I believe autobiography, the main selection criterion at the time was one's competence in handling the different Chinese dialects. In those days, there wasn't a ghost of a chance for a Chinese to be an inspector, even if you had a very high education. I knew there was racial discrimination in the whole system, but I still feel that I still felt that I could render a service to the government and to Chinese immigrants as well. And he worked on Angel Island from 1927 to 1938. His starting salary was $130 a month. And he said that that really was a big part of why he accepted the position, because the jobs he was able to get in Chinatown were working like a grocery store clerk, and that was $30 a month. Working as an interpreter on Angel Island also meant he got vacation time. However, it did not mean that he was considered part of the civil service. So he didn't get a pension, and people could be fired quite easily. But he lived in Berkeley, and he commuted. There were 9 interpreters at the time that he was working there. He says they got along really well, and he describes his commute, which I like imagining. I think I like imagining it because I lived in Oakland when I lived up in the Bay Area, and his commute to Angel Island sounds pretty similar to my commute to Angel Island. But morning walk, 2 blocks to catch the train to the pier. There's the pier in Oakland. Take the ferry to San Francisco, walk to Pier 5, take the 8:30 government cutter to Angel Island, begin work at 9 or 10, take a lunch break, off at 4:30, back to San Francisco by 5. Again, he says there was quite a bit of camaraderie amongst the interpreters, but very little between the interpreters and the inspectors, for the obvious reason that we didn't want people to think we were in cahoots with them. I never once attended their annual picnic. And I want to play, we have this recorded, this interview we have with him. I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's actually not that easy to hear. I'm going to make sure that I have audio turned on though, but I do think it's worth hearing his voice, even though it's kind of hard to understand. It takes a second to kick in.
Usual session then, a couple hours before you take a break?
Well, we work, say we begin at 9 o'clock or 10:30, we generally take a little break,
Oh,
you
so-
know, yeah.
so it's just
You
like
know, at that
coffee
time, there's no such thing as coffee break, but we do take
it's
a break, you know,
arbitrary,
yeah,
depending on how you feel.
yeah.
I mean, when you go there, you see, you get there at 9 o'clock. It doesn't mean by 9:05 everybody's on the case.
Everyone-
Sometimes you have to wait 10 or 15 or 20 minutes even before you get on the case, because sometimes the inspectors, he gets a case, you know, and he
Yeah,
wants
to
some
study
time
it
to
first,
study it before he's ready to call in the applicant or the petitioner or whoever in to interpret, you see.
He goes on in his interview to talk about the different inspectors and how they had different styles. And some of them you would be interpreting for a really long period of time, and they would ask so many questions, and he said it got really boring. And that some inspectors didn't trust who they were talking to. But he said in his view, other inspectors seemed to trust who they were talking to. That there was one case that he remembers that there had been somebody who came in under that identity before, and this person is also claiming that same identity, but the inspector said, I can't prove which one is right and which one is wrong, so I have to trust this person. And so there's different accounts of these different levels of trust, of identity. Once he resigned, he became a pastor at the Oakland Chinese United Methodist Church, and the picture is of him there. Zelf B. Jackson, he was an inspector. And this is supposed to come later. I'll show it to you later. And this is an interview that was done after he had already left the Immigration Services for quite some time. This was 14, no, it wasn't 14 years later, but he had been with Angel Island. He had been with the INS for 14 years. And this interview is taken much later, but he has asked to recount what years you started working for the INS and what kinds of positions you held. Originally, I began with immigration in Washington, D.C. in June 1929 in a clerical job in the accounts and personnel section. And I was promoted and transferred to San Francisco on July 1st, 1934 as an immigrant inspector, as they called them at the time. I continued to work there until late 1935, then I became a naturalization examiner stationed at 7th and Mission in San Francisco. I continued there until the Immigration Service was established in the Appraisers Building, and I can't remember the exact date, but it was at 630 Sansom, formerly called the Appraisers Building, and continued with immigration in various jobs until 1948 when I resigned. So he was only on Angel Island for a year, but he does remember things from working there and was with immigration for quite some time. In your duty as an immigrant inspector in the Chinese section, I remember when we first talked, you said there was nothing like it anywhere in the US. Can you elaborate a little about what your duties were in that position and whether or not you needed any special training? Now I have to move my toolbar. Here we go. Well, the duties were mainly to sit on what were known as boards of special inquiries, which consisted of 3 immigration personnel, usually 2 inspectors and 1 recorder. And we examined by questioning, usually wives and arriving children from China applying for admissions into the country. Later on, Felicia Lowe, who's the interviewer, goes on to say, wasn't there also an inspector? And he says, wasn't there also an interpreter? And he says, yes, also an interpreter. And again, this is not the whole transcript, but pieces of the transcript that I think are useful in highlighting his work and his perspective on his work. Felicia, I would think that it would be easy to make mistakes answering many of those questions. At this moment, I couldn't tell you how many windows or many steps led up to my house. Jackson, that is so true. You know, we have 2 sons, and after I'd been with immigration for a while, the 2 boys lived in the same room and slept in the same room, and they were 6 years apart. And just as an experiment, I got them one time and got them outside and asked them how many windows are in your room. What type is the chandelier? Where is the switch located? And do you know? They would have failed. They didn't agree on the location of the furniture in their room, which was a small room. You're quite right. It was different to remember for anyone. Difficult to remember for anyone. Okay. Who seems to have compassion here? Felicia. Was there any assumption or suspicion that more sons were paper sons than real ones? Oh yes, on the part of everyone. First of all, you had to be struck by the fact that returning Chinese, when they set up claims for the children, they were normally 95% male, like 10 males and 1 female. They usually seem to put in 1 female occasionally for some reason. I don't know why, but I can recall one man that claimed 13 male children in Chinese numerical order. Yik, Yi, Sam, Yai, but I think he got them all over here. So in some parts of the transcript, he's saying, you know, we believed the immigrants and we trusted them. And in other parts, he's saying, well, yeah, we looked at them with suspicion. And it's probably true that there's a mix in here of all of this. After he works on Angel Island, he is promoted. This is a letter of his promotion. I'll just read this section here. I've carefully canvassed the situation as well as personnel in this district and have come to the conclusion that Special Inspector Zelf B. Jackson is the best qualified officer we have in this district to take over the supervision of the division under discussion. And so he is seen as somebody who is successful in his role and goes on to be promoted. Ty Leung Schultz is an amazing woman. She's probably, I want to say quite famous, but I think that's in the world of Angel Island in the know. She was born in San Francisco's Chinatown in 1887. When she was 12 years old, she ran away to the Presbyterian mission home in Chinatown rather than be sent to Montana to enter into an arranged marriage. At the mission home under the tutelage of Donaldina Cameron, Ty learned English and became a Christian woman. She started interpreting for Miss Cameron and assisting on many police raids of Chinatown brothels. So this account comes directly from a project we have called Immigrant Voices, and it's her grandson that wrote this about her. Whoops. It was because of her dedicated compassion and English language skills that Ty was recommended for a federal civil service position at the new immigration station at Angel Island in 1911. She was the very first Chinese American woman to be employed by the federal government when she accepted the position of interpreter and assistant matron. She's also the first Chinese woman to vote in a presidential election. And this is her quote from that. My first vote, oh yes, I thought long over that. I studied. I read about all your men who wished to be president. I learned about the new laws. I wanted to know what was right, not to act blindly. It was at Angel Island that she met Charles Schultz. So this is the two of them pictured together. He was quite a bit taller than her, apparently. So they're both seated here. But apparently when he stood up, he towered quite a bit over her. He was about 6 feet tall, I think. He was an immigration inspector. They fell in love and they wanted to marry. But California had anti-miscegenation laws. So they left California. They went to Washington State to get married because that state allowed interracial marriage. And she got fired for marrying a white man. Enclosed here with find original letter from the acting secretary of this department accepting your resignation as Chinese interpreter at the station effective at the close of March 31st, 1913. This suggests she resigned. Other accounts suggest she was asked to resign. By all accounts, she faced extreme discrimination by marrying her husband, and he did as well. So they left. With some difficulty, they did end up finding work, and they lived together in California until Charles's death in 1935. So he died fairly young. And his death left Ty to raise their children alone. She found work as a bookkeeper with the San Francisco Chinese Hospital, later as a night shift operator with the Pacific Telephone's Chinatown Exchange. She also provided translation services for members of the Chinese community in San Francisco and really was a community fixture. And then once these games were introduced in Chinatown in the 1930s, she made a reputation for herself as a local pinball wizard. She continues working as a community advocate in San Francisco. At the age of 61, she was arrested for allegedly driving women to abortion clinics. In December of 1948, after an investigation and trial, the charges against her were dropped, and she lives in San Francisco until her death. And a quote from her, she says, "I spent my life interpreting for people who needed my help." So she was a real central community advocate and figure. please do stay connected with us. We have all of these different ways to do it. You can submit your own story for Immigrant Voices as well. I know we've gone over by just a couple minutes, but if anybody has any questions for Stephen or we can stay on for, I think, a couple minutes to answer any.
I do want to mention just one thing that I had neglected in my effort to stay within my time limit. When Margaret Daly started at Ellis Island, one of those requirements was to be from a quote reputable nursing program that pretty much excluded all nurses who were also women of color. Education was segregated in most parts of the country. There were a couple of nursing schools that were dedicated to African American women. Those, in the eyes of the Public Health Service, were not, quote, reputable. So for the majority of Margaret's tenure, we're talking about an all-white nursing force. That was definitely something that a dynamic that was in play. And that Danielle explained so articulately about Angel Island, it was also a factor at Ellis Island too, to be sure.
Yeah, those were national laws.
Mhm.
All right. If you have any questions, comments, you're welcome to share them. Otherwise, please do stay in touch with us, and we look forward to talking to you or seeing you at another event. If you are local to the Bay Area, on Saturday, August 2nd is Barbecue Without Borders. I believe tickets are still open, and Gabe and I will be there.
Thank you, Nancy. Very nice of you.
Yes, thank you.
And I guess I had a question. You know, you talked about the water tanks being filled up twice a day by boats. Did they, like when I saw those water tanks, I thought, oh, well, they're collecting rainwater or something like that. I didn't know it was that labor intensive. Like that's really amazing. Ellis Island, we had a pipe bringing water from New Jersey that was frequently broken. That's why a lot of those engineers and plumbers were on staff. That's really amazing to me that it was twice a day, like every day, or if
I saw one line that said they had to do it twice a
yeah,
day. I haven't been
that's
able to like look into that more deeply, so I'm not entirely sure.
yeah.
I was surprised by. I
I'm
thought it was
surprised
like at
they
least a week.
yeah, I'm surprised they let the families living there take baths if they're
Well,
trucking
it's
all
one of
this
the
water over.
reasons why they didn't have fresh water in the immigration station. That the shower water
Oh, okay.
was seawater.
All right.
The water was really limited. Nancy, I'm also sorry that more folks didn't join, but that's why we record it. It's always great when more people come. But this way it'll also go on YouTube, so our conversation isn't only the 6 of